Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today on the segment, we are honored to welcome back Dr. Nolan Higdon. He is a media critic and scholar, author and co-author of numerous books, including The Anatomy of Fake News, United States of Distraction, Podcaster's Dilemma, Let's Agree to Disagree, a book we did for Rutledge on critical thinking and critical media literacy. And most recently, he's one of the co-authors of The Media and Me, which is a guide to critical media literacy for young people. Nolan is regularly interviewed around the country on issues around media and politics. And of course, we're delighted to bring him back here today. Nolan Higdon, welcome back to the program.
All right. Thanks so much for having me, Mickey.
So Nolan, recently, and you and I have talked about this for quite some time, and you managed to put together more than 3,000 words, almost a chapter-length piece here for one of the longer dispatches we publish at projectcensored.org. No turning back. We can't reverse the damage done by poor pandemic reporting, but the fourth estate must do better. And just in the beginning here, I wanted to put, we had a disclaimer about this because anytime it seems that people begin talking about pandemic reporting and want to criticize media coverage of it, people tend to focus on the subjects rather than the overall meta-analysis of the establishment press coverage, their biases, their censorship. And so in the article, naturally, you talk about issues around masks. You mention media coverage of vaccines and virus origins. But clearly, the article is not about the efficacy of masks or mandates. It's not about where the virus actually came from. It's about how the corporate media framed and covered those events, and unfortunately, how they often botched reporting on such crucial matters, censored legitimate counter narratives that posed important questions, and ultimately diminished its own credibility and trustworthiness in the eyes of the American public, which this year is now at an historic low point. And simply put, based on the article, we, the people, deserve better from our fourth estate, and they really have some important work to do to restore public trust. Nolan Higdon, tell us what your article is about.
Yeah, well said, Mickey. The article is not about necessarily the science behind any of these things, masks, the origin of COVID or any of that. But it's really about looking at what and how the media covered these topics and how often where there was a divide amongst the scientific community, those in media decided to come down on one side or another and dismiss any argumentative opinion outside of the one they were providing. And it really cost audiences a year, maybe 2 years of valuable reporting and valuable processing that could have been used to better understand things like the origin of COVID, lockdowns, the necessity of masks, the best vaccine distribution process. All these things were not really left up for debate. Instead, what we noticed were trends in media where folks, again, just came down on sort of one side of things, was very rigid, and you were dismissed as kind of a loon or a conspiracy theory, or perpetuating the pandemic if you dared to ask questions. And what has emerged in the subsequent years since this type of reporting began is that there actually is, substantive division amongst the scientific community on some of these questions. And so in hindsight, it would have been much better if the press had reported that, hey, look, we're trying to figure out these issues. Here's what some people are saying. Here's what others are not. We as the press are just kind of reporting what scientists are saying. But that's not the approach they took. Instead, they often utilized and rested their reporting upon establishment sources. And a lot of the establishment sources are not practicing scientists. They may have, PhDs or MDs or whatever, but they're not practicing scientists. They're practicing policymakers. And a lot of news media conflated policy making with science, and it led to a lot of problems that I think held back the public from having sophisticated conversations about critical aspects of the pandemic and our response.
Well, Nolan Higdon, one of the issues tackled here was about COVID origins. And some now say, well, what's the difference where it came from? We're trying to get past the pandemic. Whether it was zoological coming from the wet market in China, or did it come out of a lab by an accident? Was it leaked on purpose? I mean, there are a whole host of things. Sam Husseini has, of course, been doing good independent research on lab issues, but the lab leak theory was originally just completely dismissed because it was connected to the Trump administration, and sort of as part of the Trump derangement syndrome, anybody that wanted to investigate or just do basic research to see how valid of a hypothesis even is this was ridiculed. The establishment media itself, after the Biden administration came in, even had a brief mea culpa and a self-reflective moment when even mainstream establishment media critics themselves and major academic institutions of journalism began to say, we really dropped the ball on the research on that, regardless of what anyone thinks. And the American public is increasingly interested in the reality of this. And so maybe we should look into it. But what you've discovered and what you write about is that Anthony Fauci and others, they actually worked inside government to dissuade anybody from bothering to investigate any of these claims at all, putting their thumbs on the scale, favoring the wet market theory, even though there was actual discussion or debate happening behind the scenes. And again, the article isn't taking sides about what the answer is. Neither are we. We're simply talking about a gross failure of the Fourth Estate to effectively and ethically and transparently keep the public informed about very important issues.
Yeah, that's a really good point that bears repeating. At the top of the article, the Project Censored, where it was originally published, notes that this article is not drawing a conclusion about where COVID began. I note that in the article multiple times. So if anybody accused me of that, all that says is they probably read the title and drew their own conclusion. The 21st century version of judging a book by its cover. But for those who actually do read the article, they will find what you're pointing out. And to get back to your original question, I think it's absurd not to question where this virus began. If it began naturally, there's a whole host of things we have to do or think about to protect a pandemic like this from ever happening again from nature. If it came from a lab, there's a whole host of things we need to do to make sure it never comes from a lab again. So where it comes from is a really critical question for dealing with the future. I know a lot of people don't like to look to the past because they can't change things that have been done regardless of how uncomfortable they are. But it's very helpful to look at the past to determine what we want to do in the future, especially when it comes to pandemics. It's not like it would be like the equivalent of like a scientist in 2020 looking at COVID and refusing to look back at like what we did during like the flu epidemic. Of course, the scientists look back at the past. What has been done? What do we know? How can we use this knowledge? And in the article, I talk about how that discovery of knowledge and critical thinking through existing evidence was simply just suppressed throughout the pandemic by some of the policy leaders and the press, rather than holding those people accountable as the First Amendment of the Constitution empowers them to do. Instead, the press really acted like a megaphone and echoed these viewpoints. Fauci knew from his own community, now we know due to leaked communications, that there was debate amongst the scientific community about whether or not a lab leak was plausible or whether or not it was from nature. And instead, he had them scientists write up a paper that said that it was 100% natural origins. And then he cited that paper as evidence that the scientific community had consensus, never mentioning that he commissioned the paper and that he suppressed the voices that said a lab leak was plausible. Now in 2022, starting in 2022 and now in 2023, we know the FBI, we know the Senate just had a report that came out this month. And other agencies have
Energy Department.
The Energy Department is another one, have concluded that the lab leak is plausible. Or in the Senate committee report, they actually think that's where it originated. There's plenty of other agencies who disagree. But the point being is we're still trying to figure this out. We don't know. And the news media, rather than let the citizenry get involved in that debate, dismissed people. They said it was racist to say that this was a lab leak. As Glenn Greenwald pointed out, though, it's really racist to say that Chinese people are unsanitary and eat weird meats that contract viruses in open markets. That's racist. But the news media defended that narrative and said that no, it's racist to think that a scientifically engaged country could make an error or possibly on purpose release it from a lab.
Another focus of the article, Nolan Higdon, is the disinformation crisis. The COVID pandemic really, in a lot of ways, provided cover for a war on journalism in many ways, meaning dissenting journalism or the right to even ask questions. I mean, the whole core of the scientific method is about testing hypotheses and asking questions. Yet there were times during the pandemic when Fauci in particular said that anyone who critiqued or questions his conclusions was engaging in an attack on science itself. And then, of course, there's this whole other element, the World Health Organization, United Nations, et cetera, had a whole joint statement about an infodemic that then spurred this war on disinformation that is more of a euphemism for actively pursuing censorship against unpopular narratives that challenge the status quo. Nolan Higdon.
Yeah, if you're, coming out of the election of Donald Trump put the press back on their heels. They put them on the defensive, and they used the pandemic to reassert themselves as truth. And so if you dare to challenge their narratives, they tried to scapegoat and ruin you. And this worked. Look, a lot of people lost their jobs because they wouldn't go along with vaccine mandates. A lot of people in the press were suppressed for raising concerns about Fauci and other figures. But some people simply just have too big of audiences and are too influential. You think of like Aaron Rodgers, for example. But more to the point, Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan announced he had COVID. He recovered rather quickly. He looked healthy and was able to manage his show. And he talked about the different remedies he took to deal with COVID-19. And one of them was he tried ivermectin. There's no evidence that ivermectin is responsible for his recovery. But the press sort of lampooned him because he was challenging the COVID narrative, right? That it was going to be, kill you, and we need to be totally fearful, and all people we're at such great risk, which some people were. But regardless, Rogan, they attacked Rogan and lampooned him, said he was taking horse dewormer. Now, it's true, ivermectin is used in some like horse dewormers, but it's used by billions of people for billions of reasons and tons of medicine. So they chose horse dewormer just to insult the guy and lampoon him. And they only stopped once he threatened to sue them, of course. That's when they stopped doing that. But it was an illustration of how the press is that friggin' petty, that when someone offers an alternative narrative, rather than use evidence to undermine his narrative, they borderline defame him with false and baseless reporting.
Right. And of course, Rogan also not a journalist, but has a 11, 12 million person audience, which is 4 times that of what Fox's Tucker Carlson was getting, and he was just sacked. So the real issue with corporate media and people like Joe Rogan is that he's allegedly peeling away some of their audience. And certainly we've talked about that issue before. Nolan, the article goes into a lot of detail, and of course, people can read the article No Turning Back at projectcensored.org. We'll have it linked online to the radio program, but it also talks about manufacturing consent and areas where, in particular, there are times when Anthony Fauci admitted to lying and misrepresenting information and disinforming the public himself. But many in the media had to bend over backwards and say he didn't mean that, or that's not what was happening. I mean, it's actually quite remarkable, that display of behavior. Can you comment on that briefly?
Yeah. In the science community, they call this like the noble lie, but essentially Fauci said things that he knew were false, but he thought it was for noble reasons. So initially during the pandemic, he said we wouldn't need to wear masks. But then he later on said we do need to wear masks. And he said he knew he was lying when he said we didn't need to wear masks, because he didn't want to freak people out. So everybody went out and bought masks, and there was none for like first responders. Similarly, he said he knew that we were going to need a much higher vaccine rate, like probably in the 80% of people vaccine to stop the spread of COVID-19. But he originally said much lower numbers, and like I think the 60% and things like that, because he said, I knew I was wrong, but I didn't want to freak people out by proposing such a high number. To me, regardless of the motive, it was illustrative of the fact that this person is okay with lying to the public, and the press is okay with accepting it. Even in the introductory to journalism classes, we talk about how you have to have credible sources. If this is a person who's not only lied but admitted to lying, that would not be considered a credible source. Yet the press continue to rely on Anthony Fauci, despite documented litany of opportunities they had to document his lies.
So, Nolan Higdon, we only have about a minute or two left here, and certainly there's so much detail in the article, and it is extraordinarily cited for people to look at the backgrounds of the argument about the press, about the establishment press, their framing, their coverage, their biases, their censorship, their mistakes. Let's include the fact that honest mistakes can be made in these kind of crisis situations, but your article really goes beyond the mistakes and goes beyond things that were not mistakes. They were deliberately done, and unfortunately acted in many ways for political cover or to misinform the American public. You end the article with a mea culpa, sort of the mea culpa and beyond, about what the media has been doing since. Can you encapsulate a couple of the ideas from your conclusion, Nolan Higdon?
Yeah, I'll just I bring up in the conclusion, I talk about how this article is being written around the 20-year anniversary of the Iraq War, and I think that that's a great example of how up-teen books and articles have been written about how the news media helped lie the American public into supporting the 2003 invasion of Iraq. People supported a war based on false pretenses. Everyone knows this. I was even watching Jeopardy a couple months ago, and it was a clue on Jeopardy. So even like it's a Jeopardy clue. Everyone knows that the weapons of mass destruction did not exist in Iraq. But there has been no real accountability for these folks. They move on to the next story, and they tell the public not to look at the past. Kind of like you were riffing on earlier about how people say, well, why does it matter where it started? Well, this is why it's important. If the press has these gigantic failures and we just move on to the next story, we're never going to get a robust press. So just like the people who lied us into the Iraq War, or lied about Russiagate, or lied about QAnon and January 6th and the 2020 election, I think all of these people in news media need to be held accountable and really thrown out of the profession. We need credible people doing journalism. And if you participated in acting as a megaphone for the establishment during COVID-19, you should go get a job in PR. You should get out of journalism.
Nolan Higdon, author of a recent article, No Turning Back. We can't reverse the damage done by poor pandemic reporting, but the fourth estate must do better. Very information-packed article at projectcensored.org. You can read it for free online. Nolan Higdon, thanks once again for joining us, and thanks for your cogent analysis and shining a light into the dark places where we really need to see what's going on in the fourth estate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.